Hello and welcome to Beyond Japan, an interdisciplinary podcast that looks at the broad reach of Japanese studies from within and beyond Japan. This podcast is brought to you by the Centre for Japanese Studies at the Sainsbury Institute for the Study of Japanese Arts and Cultures, in collaboration with the University of East Anglia. I'm your host, Oliver Moxham, Project Support Officer at the Sainsbury Institute and researcher of Japanese war heritage. As this year marks the 1400th anniversary of the death of Prince Shōtoku Taishi, the legendary figure who brought Buddhism to Japan, the Sainsbury Institute, together with the Sainsbury Centre for Visual Arts at the University of East Anglia, is currently collaborating with major universities and museums in Japan to create a special exhibit commemorating the anniversary. This Shōtoku Intervention will display the Sainsbury Centre's collection of Japanese Buddhist and Shinto artefacts centered around a 13th century statue which depicts one of the wives of Shōtoku Taishi. To better explain the significance of Shōtoku Taishi, Beyond Japan will be exploring over the next 3 episodes the religious, political and historical context of this dynamic period of East Asian history. We hope you enjoy our Shōtoku miniseries. Our first Shōtoku interviewee is Marcus Teeuwen, Professor of Japanese Studies at the University of Oslo, who will help us understand the changing faiths of Japan in the 7th century through the Buddhist concept of Honji Suijaku, a notion which allowed Buddhist monks to explain the gods worshipped in Japan at the time, or kami, as traces of Buddhist deities. Mark explains that our contemporary understanding of religion as competing bodies which seek to shape how people live their lives with the goal of a happy afterlife does not apply in this period of time, that the worship of deities had much more practical intentions, and that politics were at the core of the spread of Buddhism. We hope you enjoy the show. Good afternoon, Mark. Thank you for joining me on the podcast.
Thank you.
So first off, I'd like to know a bit more about you. Can you tell us about your area of expertise and how your interests have brought you there?
Yeah, I teach Japanese studies here in the University of Oslo, and I've been working mostly on the history of Japanese religion, but mostly on Shinto. And the way I started out with that, I actually spent 1.5 years at a Shinto university, one of 2 Shinto universities in Japan, as a research student this is 25 years ago or something. So there I had the opportunity to study together with prospective Shinto priests. And I didn't take my diploma because I wasn't able to do the seiza thing of sitting on your knees for long enough. But I got to know quite a lot of Shinto priests, and I got to work in shrines as a general help and for training and things like that. So that triggered my interest. Yeah, and after that, so I've tried to figure out the history of shrines and of kami worship and the conceptualization of Shinto and what was there before and what happened when it conceptualized as Shinto and all those kind of things.
Great. So the central concept to this episode is Hanji Sujaku, which you translated in your 2003 book, Buddhas and Kami in Japan, Hanji Sujaku as a combinatory paradigm as, quote, original forms of deities and their local traces, end quote. You wrote that this concept is central to pre-modern Japanese religion in that it stated that local native deities known as kami are emanations of universal Buddhist deities. Could you give a brief historic context of Honji Suijaku, explaining how it was that Buddhism and Shinto deities were brought together in this way?
Yeah, so maybe the best way to explain it is to go backwards in time, actually, and explain a little bit about Honji Suijaku historiography. Because as you probably covered already before, what happened in the 19th century is that Shinto and Buddhism were separated. But a more accurate description of what happened would be that an ideological view that sees Shinto as Japan's indigenous original religion, that was once a pure national religion, was created by throwing out everything that reminded people of Buddhism. And then, so when you start with that view or that ideology, you would say, then the question arises, so how did they get mixed up? Starting from the idea that once you had 2 pure entities, pure Buddhism versus pure Shinto, and some way they got mixed up. And then Honji Suijaku was the way that people pounced on to explain how that happened. And Honji Suijaku was then the medieval teaching, because medieval times as the Dark Age, the medieval teaching that Buddhists used to incorporate the once Shinto gods, right? So saying that, those gods, they're actually just emanations of our Buddhas. So that was like the standard theories and from the 19th century into the post-war period, I guess. And then at some point, Japanese scholars started writing about this whole thing about there being a pure Shinto in ancient times that somehow got swallowed up by Buddhism, how that has nothing to do with historical reality. And there were a lot of studies about the separation of Shinto from Buddhism in the 19th century and how the new Shinto that was created had no roots in history. So there was a lot of writing about that. But what there wasn't so much writing about was what actually happened, what it actually looked like before the separation. So how this sort of combined religion that has both Buddhas and gods in it, how that worked and what it looked like and so on. So that was what I was interested in. So Honji Suijaku, the concept itself is a Buddhist concept, right? And it comes from Buddhist theology and mainly in Japan, Tendai. And it's about how you have an essence, like, for example, cosmic enlightenment or something. And then that essence manifests itself, for example, in the form of Shakyamuni Buddha. And in that sense, then Shakyamuni, the Buddha, is an emanation or a Suijaku, a footstep, you could say a footprint on our soil, on earth, of a larger concept, larger sort of disembodied cosmic principle. So that idea was in late classical times, so it starts around the 11th, 12th century, was also applied in Japan to relation between Buddhas and kami deities. So these kami deities being explained as manifestations of Buddhas. So if you have a temple shrine complex, as you often had, where the temple has Buddhas and the shrine that guards it, so to say, the guardian deity has kami, to say that, these kami in the shrine, they're actually footsteps or manifestations of the Buddha in a different form that is adapted to Japanese reality.
I see. So when describing the nature of religion in Japan, as we've just kind of discussed, it's often simply explained that there are two faiths of Buddhism and Shinto. However, we learned in an earlier episode that Shinto does not readily lend itself to conventional understandings of a religion, and you argued in your book that worship of Shinto deities was central to Japanese Buddhism. Can you give us some examples of Shinto elements incorporated into Buddhism in Japan and indicate whether any elements of Shinto were kept separate from Buddhism?
Yeah, so the premise for your question is that you had Shinto and Buddhism, right? It helps a lot if we just put that to one side. I know that's very hard to do. But if you think about Buddhism itself, right, it has Buddhas, Bodhisattvas, Devas, which are basically gods, right? And then you've got demons and spirits and so on under it. And wherever Buddhism went, whether you're in Tibet or China or even in Southeast Asia, these spirits of the mountains, for example, mountain deities, or even Dakini, kind of evil demons, they are explained as emanations or helpers or protectors of the Buddha and the Buddhist community and the Dharma. And often that also even happens with like patriarchs or generals or whatever. They are explained as forces of the Dharma, right? And they are manifestations of Amitabha or Avalokiteshvara or something like that. For example, local mountain deities in Tibet are often explained that way. And it was the same in Japan. So I think you have to imagine when Buddhism first came to Japan, that's in the 6th century. We are in prehistorical times. But you have to imagine that the story that Japan was Shinto before Buddhism came along, we have to put that to one side as a Meiji construct and think of, okay, what did Japan actually look like? So you had people doing agriculture, growing rice in some places. In most places, you had people hunting and gathering and lots of local cultures and lots of deities in every little place. You had chieftains and so on. So there was nothing like Shinto or whatever, and you had lots of Korean immigrants, right? So a very diverse universe. of all kinds of beliefs and practices, including like all kinds of Korean and Chinese things with yin and yang and I don't know what. So, and Buddhism coming along, and as in other places in Asia, trying to put some system on top of that. Of course, not saying that Shinto should go, and because now we should become Buddhists, but saying that, yeah, Buddhism can help to, for example, tame these evil demons or these local deities. We know them by another name, something like that.
So they explained Buddhism as another way of understanding the belief systems that were sort of already kind of in place in Japan.
Yeah. So Buddhism had to make sense of itself, right, in that setting. And as everywhere else, the Buddhists did that by incorporating existing cults and ideas and deities and Buddhifying them.
Right. In an earlier episode we had about looking at modern Shinto, we saw that Shinto as we know it today is indeed a modern construct. As you said, it was a product of the Meiji Restoration. How should we understand Shinto as it was in the 6th century? Can we even call it Shinto?
Yeah, so my argument is that there was nothing like Shinto in the 6th century, right? So one thing is that the word didn't exist, but maybe that's a very minor point. But by saying, like, even if we drop Shinto, we call it a Japanese indigenous religion, for example, that there was a Japanese indigenous religion in Japan in the 6th century, I don't think that makes sense. So what was there in the 6th century, right? We are in the Kofun period. So people were building these big tombs, and that's what the period is called after. And those tombs, they have, for example, between the cults that happened at those tombs, and also other cultic sites that have been excavated from this period, and what becomes Shinto practices later, there's no connection whatsoever. So what we have is tombs, we have like bronze bells, bronze swords and implements, and in the text that we have, that we today regard as the oldest text of Shinto, so for example, Kojiki, there's not a word about any tombs. And there's not, well, tombs are mentioned, like this emperor ended up here or something, but it doesn't say anything about Haniwa, which is those ceramic figures that are put on top of the tomb and that clearly have some kind of cultic significance, but they're not mentioned at all. And there's also no mention of all these bronze bells, for example, that are excavated everywhere at ritual sites. So there's a very clear break.
Yeah, so I'm wondering, do we know if we had torii gates, the famous Shinto gates that we see around Japan today? Did we have shrines? Do we have the famous paper lightning stripes and the woven threads? Do we know that these things existed in the 6th century, or are these all modern constructions of Shinto?
Yeah, no, I don't think we don't think there were any torii gates, for example. Shrines that had buildings are definitely a later development. So one of the earliest shrines that actually had a building with the idea that the deity was dwelling in a shrine, like in a building permanently, was probably Ise. That was a very early one, at least. And people have pointed out that this is probably a Buddhist influence, like the idea of a temple, but then applied to a deity. So in the way that a Buddha lives permanently in a kind of palace, that was copied. So that's a post-Buddhist development. Yeah, the zigzag papers, they're also a lot later. So they probably derive from cloth offerings, which were a Taoist import. So yeah, those elements came together to become something that we call Shinto a lot later.
Yeah, so we can see that Shinto is a real mixture of different religions all kind of coming together in Japan in this time period.
Yeah, so when we think about Shinto, so what was there, right? Because you're also right in the sense that there must have been something, right? So it's building on something. It was just not created out of thin air either, of course. And what was that something, right? I think what is very important is what the court did with all these deities. So I think what you had a kind of a quilt kind of with lots of small chieftaindoms, right? And a lot of chieftains or local leaders who derive their authority from saying that we descend from a deity on this mountain or something like that. Or we were the ones who, for a very long time ago in the age of the gods or something, chased away the evil deities from this place so that people could live here. And therefore, we need to be making offerings to these evil deities to keep them away. And therefore, we need to be the boss in this place. So that was there. And the court created a kind of ritual system building on that. The Kojiki is an expression of that, right? So you have one pantheon of all kinds of deities and important local deities of allies of the court were put in there, and it was turned into a kind of a plot. And that plot was about the heavenly deities conquering the earthly deities and establishing heavenly order on earth. And the emperor is kind of the descendant of these heavenly deities, as are the main court allies of the emperor, while all the other local lords are descendants of earthly deities and so on. That was a court cult that I often call the Jingi system, the Jingi cult, because Jingi means heavenly and earthly deities, a Chinese concept that was imported to create this story. But yeah, it worked because there were all these local cults, right? So that could be kind of sort of put together in this new category of earthly deities. So that is one thing. And then the court appointed also court priests who made offerings to these earthly deities in the name of the heavenly deities, which is the court, both to say, we made these offerings made the rice grow, so you should pay us tribute. Or like, yeah, so your local chieftain, he has authority because he's the descendant of the earthly deities, but we are the descendants of the heavenly deities. So, there is a difference.
Kind of like how in Europe you had the princes and the kings who said we've been chosen by God and that's our right to rule. Is it similar to that?
Yeah. So this priestly function of local rulers, I think you can see it probably all over the world. And that developed also in Japan. And the court developed that further by creating a layer above it. But the interesting thing is that this whole Jingi system, as I call it, or this idea with the heavenly and the earthly deities and the court offerings to local deities far away, all that was invented, so probably started in the 7th century, which was a century after Buddhism had come to Japan. So at the same time as this was going on, the court was also trying another route, and the other route was to create this Buddhist network of temples that positioned the emperor as a kind of sponsor of the Buddha, right? So another kind of huge cosmic project of turning the land into a Buddha land and creating lots of good karma to make the rice grow and to prevent epidemics and so on. So that happened at the same time. So this Jingi cult and Buddhism, they came to Japan one after the other. Buddhism first, actually, and then this Jingi system second. And then both sort of sponsored by the same court. I mean, I'm sure lots of things were going on outside the court as well, but we simply don't know because we don't have any sources on that. But then it's only logical that the next step will be like, so for example, that this is a time of lots of epidemics in Japan, to say that those epidemics are caused by angry deities and they can be prevented or stopped by Buddhist means. So we have to build a Buddhist temple next to the shrine of this angry deity, and then the priest there can create lots of merit or good karma and transfer that to the deities, tame the deity, transform the deity into a Buddhist avatar or a manifestation of the Buddha, or at least a protector of the Buddha, or something like that, by Buddhist means. Yeah, and in that way, the two are integrated even more closely, right? And so then you see the founding of lots of shrine temples spreading around all of Japan. And
you see that that Buddhism sort of brought in this idea of structured religion and sort of the marriage of faith and politics in that sense, right?
Yeah, maybe you can put it like that. Yeah, it's very much a part of politics. So yeah, if you call it religion, it's not about converting people to do a certain lifestyle or anything like that. No, I also have a bit of a problem with sort of categorizing it as religion, because all of this is, as much as religious practice is, it's also a way of ensuring that the world flourishes, that the rice grows, that the weather is favorable, that the epidemics don't go around, that people obey, all those things of, a good rule.
Sure. So very practical purposes.
Yeah. It's not about going to hell or heaven.
Yeah. So you point to the pluralism of Buddhist deities as a central element of Honji Suijaku, indicating that this allowed it to be, quote, consciously transnational, end quote, and spread throughout India, Korea, China, and Japan. How could a transnational religion operate and communicate across such distances if it did at all?
Yeah, so I'm not sure I get your meaning, because I don't think so there's a religion out there that's operating, if you get what I mean. Yeah. But those ideas were attractive to local Japanese elites, right? I cannot really say anything about what villages were doing or anything like that, because we have no clue. But so the only thing we know is what court sources tell us. So it's all about elite plans or elite practices. So if we're talking about the 7th, 8th century or something like that, so Japan is being pulled into the world of East Asia, in the sense that the Tang Empire is expanding, and Japan has lost a few wars in Korea, and there is worries that the Chinese will invade, for example. So there's very much a need to try to update Japan to create a stronger national or a stronger state in Japan. And you see this wave of importing statecraft from Korea and China. And this is what gives the impetus to create both this Jingi system, this Jingi cult, to write down texts like the Kojiki as a national history, and to build temples all over the place. Since, after all, this was something that the Korean king Seongmyeong gave to Japan as a gift in thanks for help in a war. So he said, he has some Buddhist scriptures and a statue and some nuns, and they are monks, and they can help you to implement this new form of statecraft. So, it was obviously the thing to do at the time. So
this was seen as Buddhism was seen as essential parts to advancing civilization at that time, to advancing statecraft. You had to bring in this more structured idea of religion into the country. If we drop religion, so you had to. Okay.
So because maybe it's more like engineering. So the Korean king has learned from China that this is the way to create merit, and to stop it from raining when it shouldn't be raining, and to make the sunshine, and to make the rice grow, and to stop the epidemics, and to make sure that people don't rebel. So how do you do it? Well, you harness the powers of the Buddha, right? So you make lots of good karma, and then you spread this karma, you transfer the good karma to the king, to the rice fields, to the bad spirits that make the illness. And in that way, you make your country better. And that's what you should be doing. And I think that was very convincing. And if you think of this time as a time of, it's almost like a Black Death time, because all these epidemics are streaming in from East Asia, together with all the ideas and the immigrants and the trade that is booming in this time for the first time. They're building Chinese capitals, so putting all these people together in one little city, and then calling them in from all over Japan and sending them out again, and building post stations and provinces, and getting all these farmers to come in with tribute or for work duty to the capital. So illnesses spread in a way that they've never done before. So something has to be done about this. At the same time, China is maybe conspiring together with the Shilla Kingdom in Korea, about to invade the country. And we need all the help we can get. And if this is the new engineering, that's what we should be doing.
Yeah, so all this social change and unprecedented events that are happening is the impetus which ushers in Buddhism into Japan at this time.
Yeah, and maybe you can also imagine how that can boom. So you invest all this money in building temples in every province, 66 provinces, 2 temples in each province, and then, still the epidemics don't stop. So the conclusion is obviously that you need to build more, right? Spend more on this. So you get this kind of dynamic. If it's angry gods that cause this, right, then you should make more offerings to them. So this has its own dynamic. And what is maybe most interesting in the context of this podcast is then that we're talking one logic, one engineering or statecraft art, right? We're not talking like, okay, we had Buddhists and we had Shintoists and they were talking to each other and trying to convert each other or anything like that, right? It's not like that at all. So sure. the gods or the Buddhas or were like a fact of life, like the epidemics and the weather. And we're trying to deal with it, basically.
When we think of religions meeting in pre-modern Europe, there are a lot of bloody images of the Crusades and the Spanish Inquisition and the Reformation of England which come to mind. So as we don't have these two very established religions meeting, did Honji Suijaku allow Buddhism to totally avoid hostile resistance in Japan? Was there any resistance against Buddhism, or what was happening there?
Yeah, but now you're going back again to thinking of this as two religions that were fighting each other.
How should we be referring to Buddhism and what came before Shinto? How should we refer to these things in this context?
Yeah, so I think, if you have this combined system from the start, right? So the gods and the Buddhas, and they're all part of one reality, just like the weather or the illnesses. And we're doing all kinds of things to deal with it, right? And to solve the problems.
Sure.
And at the same time, there's also, monks are going to China to study and learn also new rituals, learn new texts, learn more about how to engineer the world. And they come back, and then Japan has its own dynamics with these gods having a big role to play in what temples are doing. I think most temples were connected to some kind of shrine, and many temples had this special task of making sure that this deity didn't unleash all kind of illness, for example, or even kill the emperor or something like that. So it's logical that these monks tried to figure out how to explain the Japanese situation as it had developed in Buddhist terms, and that this Honji Suijaku idea was an obvious tool to do that, right? So saying that in the same way as in China, monks are taming evil spirits by transferring good karma to them, or in the same way as in Tibet, Buddhas manifest themselves as mountain deities, or in the same way as in the sutras, as, for example, Avalokiteshvara manifests himself in countless ways to help these sentient beings. So in the same way in Japan, the Buddhas manifest themselves in the form of these deities. Yeah, and this is where Honji Suijaku came in handy. But it was not about two religious groups fighting each other or anything like that.
Yeah, so it's not in the sense of religion as a means of a code of ethics, a way of understanding life and what comes after life. It was in this time, in this context, Buddhism was just another way of understanding phenomena in the world around you. Of course, there's this political side which we've covered, but the best way to understand it is there wasn't these strong differences in what Buddhism taught and what the local faiths of Japan taught at the time. And that's allowed them to come together so easily.
Yeah, I think, so if you say, okay, that was Shinto and Buddhism. So Shinto and Buddhism what, right? I think there was a difference between Buddhist temples and shrines. And these shrines, they were called Jingi shrines, actually. And they were part of a different ritual system. So there were lists of shrines that got offerings in the 6th month and the 12th month, for example, or for harvesting time and planting time. And they were in a different category from temples. And I guess you also had like a difference between, okay, so you had ordained monks who work at a temple, and then you had priests who work in shrines. and who are not ordained, and who can marry and who can eat meat, for example, while monks cannot because they have these vows and vinaya and all that. So religious professionals identified as one or the other. There were a lot of categories in between too, but at least there you can see some sort of identity. But I don't think you have any sort of lay identity saying, yeah, okay, I'm Protestant, I'm Catholic, I'm Buddhist, I'm Shinto. I mean, just forget about that. That was not at all a thing. I think it never was. It still isn't, right? Except for some small new religions or something. So, and then you had these gods, right? So you can say, okay, this is a Buddha, this is a Buddhist deity, and this is a Kami, so that's a Shinto deity. But then, that's where they weave this web of Honji Suijaku saying that, yeah, this looks like a Shinto deity, but actually it's a manifestation of this Buddha and so on. So then, that is immediately also subverted. But you can only identify two things as two different forms of something if there's a difference between them in some sense, I guess. But the difference there is it mentioned in the sutras or not, basically? Yeah.
Right. Yeah, we have a very interesting artifact at our museum here in Norwich, the Sainsbury Centre, which is a scroll which depicts Shinto deities, and it tries to explain them as Buddhist deities. So it's a really tangible example of that. So when looking at the Asuka period in Japan, which is roughly the 6th and 7th century, when Prince Shōtoku Taishi supposedly brought Buddhism to Japan via Korea, we can see there were heavily political connotations in this introduction as the move sought to bolster the power of the imperial family. Do we know if the politics behind the spreading of Buddhism shapes the way it was practiced in Japan?
Practiced at the time or later?
At the time.
At the time, yeah. Yeah, I think Buddhism came to Japan probably in at least two different ways. And one way is the way we know least about, I guess. And this is, for example, with immigrants or refugees who came from the mainland. So popular practices that spread from below. Very hard to know anything about that, but it's very likely it happened. And then there was the top-down part of it. And the top-down part of it was the state or the emperor or the court building huge temples and investing lots and lots of money in that, or resources. So these temples, they were the biggest buildings. So they had a big staff of people, all with fancy clothing and not really doing anything productive. I guess what they were producing was this good karma, which of course was a very valuable substance, and transferring that to the court and the emperor and the state and the land and the people. So it's a bit of a ritual economy in the sense that taxes are plowed back in the system that created those taxes in the first place, which is the Buddhist establishment. And that part of Buddhism, those state temples, they were basically closed off from normal people. So they were banned by law from preaching to commoners, doing anything else but state business. All these monks had to be ordained at the imperial temple Todaiji in the capital. Yeah, so very much state affair at this stage. So yeah, obviously that has a lot of influence on the way Buddhism is practiced, right? So people who ended up in these state monasteries and state temples, they were basically ordered to go there.
Yeah, it's interesting to think that there's two sides to this. There's the top-down, bottom-up introduction of Buddhism, as it were, of which we only know one side of the story, which is obviously the side that where there is text, which is which comes out of the imperial courts. And I suppose that's where most Buddhist artifacts from the time would have come from, would have been those created for these imperial temples. Is that correct? Yes, yeah, exactly. And it's also, I guess, you were talking about the Kofun period, so Asuka period. This is the time when they stopped building Kofun, right? Yeah. And I think it's also very telling. So the temples replaced the Kofun. The Kofun were also before they are the size of pyramids, right? They were an enormous investment of labor and resources.
designed to reflect power and to build power. And temples were often built next to the biggest kofuns, and they replaced them as a new form of ritual power, dominating the landscape in the same way as the kofun had done before. And the kofun were abandoned. They were not used afterwards actively to create for ritual purposes, for example. They were just abandoned and overgrown. And the temples took over that role. So that also tells you something about what temples were for, right?
Yeah, very interesting. So thank you for answering all my questions. Before we finish the episode, could you share with us what other projects you're currently working on?
Yeah, right now I'm writing about about festivals, about the Gion Festival, to be precise. So, which is a huge festival in Kyoto, and it's sort of an interesting festival in this context also, because it goes back all the way to the 10th century, and it's one of the three big festivals, as they say these days, of Japan, a summer festival in the old capital. The deities in there today they are supposed to be Shinto deities like Susanoo and so on, and they are housed in a shrine, Yasaka Jinja. But if you go back to the 1871 it became Shinto, 1870. So these deities had completely different names, and the main one was called Gozu Tenno, which is the Deva king, with the ox-headed Deva king from northern India. And the Yasaka Jinja shrine was a temple with temple monks closely connected to the Enyakuji or Mount Hiei complex right outside of Kyoto. And today you can see that, the shrine talks about Susanoo and like these deities of the Kojiki and about Shinto, and it has got Shinto priests and it's a complete Shinto thing. But if you go into Kyoto city, into the streets that put up like the floats that are in the parades and so on, they all have their own streets, shrines and street altars and so on. And they all have scrolls and statues and I don't know what of Gozu Tenno, the way it was from before Meiji. So very messy too. And if you look at these kind of practices, then that actually sort of are very much out there in the street, so that are the big symbols of Japanese culture also. You can see that, so this attempt to separate, to create this distinction between Shinto and Buddhism has not really filtered through at all.
Yeah. Well, fascinating. I'm sure we all look forward to hearing more about that research. Great. Well, thank you for joining me on the show today, Mark. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you.
You can find a link to Mark's research profile in the description below. Next week, we'll be joined by Professor Brian Lowe of Princeton University, who will help us understand the challenge of determining history from myth when looking at ancient texts. We hope you'll join us then. Thank you for listening.